How many mega projects does China have? Dozens? Hundreds? Thousands? Yeah, this country loves to amaze the world with the results of its work, all wrapped up in concrete, steel, aluminum, or any other shell. But what really stands out is how China works with deserts. This can definitely be called one huge mega project. Millions of tons of sand dug up to turn a lifeless area into something green. And China doesn't care which desert it's transforming. Whether it's the dangerous Gobi or the shifting Taklamakan, China knows how to handle any land full of sand. Any method's on the table. Sometimes it's hands-on work, sometimes more advanced solutions come into play. Overall, China knows how to turn even the most barren land into something else. We're going to tell you exactly how they do it. Great Green Wall. Well, let's start by heading to the Gobi Desert, the sixth largest in the world after the cold wastelands of Antarctica and the Arctic, the Sahara, the deserts of Australia, and the barren lands of the Arabian Peninsula. The Gobi is located in northern China, which shares it with Mongolia. But it was the Chinese government that decided to implement a large-scale land reclamation project here to create what's called the Great Green Wall. From the name, you can tell the ambitions of this program are just as big as those of the other famous Great Wall, and you know, it's exactly like that. Unlike the warm and green southern part of China, the desert-like north is covered by forests in only 5% of its area. And this project was meant to increase that depressing figure by 3 times. The thing is, the Gobi Desert is gradually expanding. The intensity of sandstorms is also growing to the point where they even reach neighboring Japan, North Korea, and South Korea. And in order to prevent people from being buried by sand, the government started a forest planting program called 3 North Shelter Forest Program. Yep, the Great Green Wall is also called that because it stretches across the north, northeast, and northwest of the country. Try to imagine the scale of this project for a second. The country's authorities came up with the project several decades ago, back in 1978, and they plan to finish it in 2050. The project has been advancing very successfully, with the country's residents putting all their efforts into it. By 2009, the trees covered more than 193,000 square miles, creating the world's largest artificial forest. According to a 2020 report, the tree planting programs led to a significant absorption of carbon dioxide and even helped mitigate climate change. As a result, the Gobi, which was expanding by 3,800 square miles each year in the 1980s, started shrinking in 2022 by more than 770 square miles each year. Can you imagine how successful China's been in this project? They literally made the desert move in the opposite direction. By the way, this major change wasn't achieved only thanks to the specialists working on China's program. Regular Chinese people were also busy planting trees in the desert. This woman, Yin Yuzhen, made Gobi green for 40 years, planting nearly 74,000 acres of land with her husband. With people like that, it feels like China's untouchable. So in 2020, they figured out the project works. What will they do next, all the way until 2050? Development, development, and more development. China's planning to plant about 137,000 square miles of forest, which will form a wall around 3,000 miles long and about 900 miles wide. We'll see how all this turns out in the future, but even now, China has something to be proud of. The desert has started shrinking, and the number of sandstorms has gone down too. Greenbelt. But the Gobi's far from being the only desert in China. This is the Taklamakan, which people call the Sea of Death. Although it's smaller than the Gobi, just 130,000 square miles compared to 502,000 square miles, the Taklamakan is considered the second largest desert, with shifting sand dunes covering 85% of its area. The natural conditions in this place are extremely harsh. The sand dunes are constantly shifting due to powerful winds, and they're always destroying the meadows and residential areas. The worst part is that Taklamakan, like the Gobi, is also gradually expanding. So the situation looks pretty bleak. The desert will keep swallowing up more and more land. However, you didn't think that China's fans of mega projects and greenery would just ignore Taklamakan, did you? Once again, the Great Green Wall comes to the rescue. The project's name is actually different now. It's Greenbelt, but the idea is still the same: to limit the desert, stop it from spreading. So Taklamakan has basically been locked in. The desert's been completely surrounded by a 1,890-mile greenbelt. This massive initiative took 40 years, during which the first 1,715 miles of the Greenbelt were completed, The last 177 miles started in 2022, required an army of 600,000 people to plant desert-resistant species, desert poplar, red willow, and saxaul trees. The greenbelt not only prevents the desert from spreading, it also boosts the region's economic growth. Some planted species like medicinal desert hyacinth can bring financial benefits here. Devouring the lake. But let's not rush to praise China. Everyone has their flaws, and China has a really big one. We'll talk about that, of course, but a bit later. For now, let's talk about one of the most telling examples of how a country literally destroys itself for the sake of industrial development. Decades of mass urbanization in China have led to a huge demand for sand to make glass, concrete, and other materials used in construction. So the question came up, why not just take sand from the deserts to meet these needs? Sounds like a great idea, but the most sought-after material actually comes from rivers and lakes, not from barren deserts. Look, this is China's largest freshwater lake, Poyang Lake. Despite its proud title, they've started digging sand right out of it. These are the ships that made it happen. They just sail to the right spot and then suck the sand right off the bottom. As a result, the ongoing sand extraction caused the lake's water level to drop, which made things worse for local farming. And the local fauna probably didn't thank anyone for the reduced water level. The fish and birds lost a big part of their habitat. The lake is also a key flood runoff area for the Yangtze River, which overflows its banks in the summer and can cause huge damage to crops and property. Even though the government took steps to limit sand extraction, these efforts didn't amount to anything. In the end, the resources of this once vibrant and lively lake were simply drained. Still, desert projects are great for saving animals, agriculture, and all the other things that suffer from the encroaching sand. The highway. By the way, the Chinese are trying to stop the spread of deserts, not just by planting trees. China isn't shy about building roads there. Why not? If most of the country's territory will still be taken up by lifeless land for a long time. After all, it takes a long time to see results from greening projects. And so here we are again, back in the Taklamakan. As we've already mentioned, it's an impassable and brutal desert, but even here you need to get around somehow, even though it's clear that the area is completely uninhabited. That's why a decision was made to build a road here, and not just one, but three, the main one and two additional ones. The construction of the main Lunmen Highway started back in 1993. The initial reason wasn't to create convenient infrastructure for locals, but to expand the oil industry, which required quick deliveries through the desert. However, just 2 years later, the highway was open to anyone who wanted to use it, and when it became clear that one highway wasn't enough, two more were built. The 97-mile Taki was opened 7 years later, and 5 years after that, the Ahe, which stretched for 263 miles. Of course, on such a tricky piece of land, there were bound to be problems. Even though a huge amount of heavy machinery worked hard to clear the sand from the roads, it still ended up on the highway and made it hard for vehicles to pass. To solve this, bushes and other plants were planted along the road, their roots holding the sand in place. The Chinese also built a massive irrigation system to pump water for the vegetation along the highway. Also, every 2.5 miles along the road, they put up a shed for maintenance to keep the irrigation going for these roadside bushes and protect the road from the sand. It might sound weird for such a dead place, but the ecology here is actually just fine. The Taklamakan Desert Highway became the first carbon zero highway in China. Every one of the 109 irrigation wells along the highway runs on clean energy. The project includes 86 solar power plants, which have already generated over 5 million kilowatts of green electricity. It's important to note that this project not only helps protect the environment, but also reduces diesel fuel consumption by 1,000 tons per year and cuts CO2 emissions by 3,410 tons. Overall, China's actively promoting carbon neutrality, strengthening its role as one of the leaders in renewable energy. Railways. If you thought the Chinese stopped at building highways, think again. They even built railroads in the desert. On some parts, it was simply impossible to lay regular roads, and with China's constant need to move coal, the railway became the perfect solution. 90% of the Linz Railway, which is 439 miles long, runs through areas where there's no access to highways. The complex system with 180 bridges and 1,000 tunnels and underpasses was opened for freight transport in 2009 and just a year later for passengers. Things weren't so easy here either. Sandstorms and moving dunes, like on the highway, regularly buried the tracks and messed up the maintenance. In the first year alone, more than 10,000 workers were mobilized, nearly $500,000 were spent clearing the tracks, building sand barriers, and planting trees. On top of that, 9 sand control centers were set up along the route. So fighting sand is a tough job, and sometimes nothing works. However, the Chinese still try. For instance, they've shown the world that a fantastic way to deal with shifting sand dunes is by using special nets. They serve as great protection for any route that needs regular maintenance. Actually, working with these kinds of setups is really hard. The workers have to shovel sand off the tracks with spades and strong winds, and it's very likely that the sand cleared in the morning will build up again by the afternoon, and they'll have to clear it again to keep the railroad running smoothly. Electric power. Another key achievement of China in developing its deserts is its approach to electricity. We've already covered some points when discussing the highways, but it's impossible not to mention the much more ambitious and striking projects. Here's one of them. It's a massive, glowing, sunflower-shaped structure made of 12,000 mirrors that concentrate sunlight onto the central heat absorption tower. This is the largest solar thermal power station in China, located in the city of Dunhuang. At the top of the 850-foot tower, the heat absorber collects energy to heat up molten salt, which flows inside. Then, the salt is used to generate steam at high temperature and pressure, which drives a steam turbine generator. After that, electricity is produced. The power plant was commissioned in December 2018 and is designed for an annual output of 390 million kilowatts. According to the plant's CEO, at full capacity, it can produce 100,000 kilowatts of electricity per hour, which is enough to power 1,000,000 100-watt light bulbs for an hour. Unlike traditional photovoltaic power plants, solar thermal power plants can store heat, providing continuous and stable power, which makes them a complement to typical solar energy, which, oddly enough, always needs the sun. This is a solar panel project from another desert, Kibuchi. It's the largest desert photovoltaic power plant in China, covering an area of about 15 million square feet and made up of more than 196,000 photovoltaic panels. The panels form a unique pattern of a galloping horse, which makes the station not only an outstanding energy project, but also the world's largest image made from solar panels, listed in the Guinness World Records. So far, the project has generated over 2.3 billion kilowatt hours of green energy, which is equivalent to saving 760,000 tons of coal and reducing carbon dioxide emissions by 1.85 million tons. The station has also contributed to greening about 4 square miles of desert land. Pretty impressive. By the way, how's the greening project in the Kibuchi Desert going? Oh, it's doing great. After hundreds of years of grazing that wiped out the vegetation, the area's had a real turnaround. Now about a third of the land is covered in greenery, and special plants are helping to keep the moving sands from taking over the farms and villages. The livestock's back, and that's brought along new secondary industries, opening up new opportunities for the local people. This positive turn of events didn't happen by chance. The project started back in 1988 when a man from Kibuchi took control of a nearly bankrupt salt factory. At that time, getting the salt to the market was a real problem because there was no direct access to the railroad, and they had to drive 220 miles out of the way. Frequent sandstorms also made transportation difficult, and without a new road, the salt mines had no chance of surviving. Building the road wasn't easy. The sand quickly swallowed it up, and that's when it became clear that taming the desert could only work if the local community benefited from it. At first, locals were paid to plant trees, but most of the saplings died because no one cared if they survived. Then they started offering bonuses for every tree that survived, and the survival rate skyrocketed. In addition, a new technique for planting willow trees was created involving high-pressure water jets. This greatly simplified the process, reducing the planting time to just 10 seconds per sapling. As a result, Kibuchi is not only becoming greener, but is also helping to revive the region's economy. Desertification. So as you see, there are a lot of problems with deserts in China, but it's not just this country. Arid lands cover about 13 million square miles on the planet, which is 40% of the Earth's land area. More than half of these lands are in Asia and Africa, and their size keeps growing. In recent decades, China's been doing extensive research on desertification and its effects. The country's facing severe drought, which has sharply worsened since the 1980s. But what's causing it? Is it just China's geographic location to blame? In fact, desertification is caused by climate change, poor water conditions, bad vegetation, soil problems, and of course sandstorms. But all of these are natural causes, and as we know, people often try to alter nature, and the consequences don't take long to show. So desertification in China is partly the country's fault, and that's the flaw we mentioned earlier. China is literally draining every single resource, possible or impossible, from its land. One of the most problematic resources in China is water. While the south, with its regular rainfall and milder climate, usually doesn't face such issues, the dry north, with its low levels of precipitation, suffers a lot from a lack of water resources. All water here goes to industry, agriculture, and the growing population. The solution is to build new artisan wells and dams, but this causes the rivers to lose their flow. Sometimes a river dries up before it even reaches the sea. For example, the second longest river in China, the Yellow River, stays dry in its lower reaches for about 6 months a year. Also, groundwater is slowly disappearing. Another problem is deforestation driven by industry. When the People's Republic of China was founded in 1949, forests covered 8% of the country. But with industrialization came a demand for fuel, and the solution was to cut down more trees. On top of that, the booming agricultural sector has been pushing the land beyond its limits, damaging its structure and draining it of nutrients. For instance, grazing livestock weakens the soil, leaving it defenseless against erosion, eventually washing away in rain or drying out completely. That's actually why China lost most of its territory back then. But as we found out today, the country's really working hard to turn things around. And it's doing a great job at it.